Los Angeles International Airport was bustling as usual, conversations blending with the sound of luggage wheels rolling across the marble floor. Amid the hurried crowd, a man stood quietly in the first-class line. No one paid him any attention, not because he wasn't important, but because his appearance was too simple. A faded plaid shirt, old jeans, and worn-out boots, with a rugged backpack slung over his shoulder, looking as if it had traveled the world. He didn't resemble the typical first-class passengers. He was Keanu Reeves. Right behind him stood Victor Harding, a successful businessman, dressed in an expensive suit, polished leather shoes, and strong cologne. Every movement he made radiated self-importance, as if he wanted the entire world to know he was someone significant. His gaze swept over Keanu with disdain. Unable to hold back his curiosity, Victor sneered. "First class? I never thought someone dressed like that would be flying in my section." Keanu turned to look at him, his face calm and unbothered. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises," he replied lightly. Victor frowned. He was used to people shrinking under his attitude, but Keanu didn't. This man wasn't offended, nor did he seem interested in arguing. He just stood there, unaffected, as if Victor's words carried no weight. What Victor didn't know was that this encounter would completely change his perspective on life. The boarding announcement rang through the terminal, and the first-class passengers began moving forward. Keanu and Victor, though neither wanted to, ended up walking side by side. While Victor strode confidently, as if first class was his rightful place, Keanu remained composed, unhurried, unconcerned with the attention around him. When they reached their seats, Victor glanced at his ticket once more for confirmation, but when he looked up, he froze. Right next to his seat, Keanu had placed his backpack down and was settling in comfortably. Victor blinked, as if refusing to believe what he was seeing. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Keanu simply smiled, glancing at him. "Looks like we'll be traveling together," he said, his voice as calm as ever, completely unfazed by Victor's irritation. Victor crossed his arms, trying to mask his annoyance. He couldn't believe that the man he had just looked down on was sitting next to him in first class. Keanu was nothing like the people Victor was used to seeing here. There was no flaunting, no pretension, and that unsettled him. As the last of the economy passengers boarded, Victor decided to continue the conversation, this time without the playful jabs. He wanted to know who this man really was. "So, what do you do for a living?" Victor asked, his tone half mocking, half inquisitive. Keanu, adjusting his backpack beneath his seat, looked up and answered simply, "I make movies." Victor raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small TV roles?" He chuckled, as if certain the man beside him was just some struggling actor trying to break into the industry. Keanu simply shook his head, his smile hinting at something Victor didn't understand. "Something like that." Victor laughed as if he had just won a game where his opponent didn't even know they were playing. He had concluded that this man was nobody special, a person without status, without luxury branding, certainly not someone on his level. But what Victor didn't know was that, in just a few hours, he would be the one questioning everything he once believed. As the plane reached cruising altitude, first-class service began. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering passengers fine wine, sparkling champagne, and all the luxuries expected at this level of travel. Victor, full of confidence, smiled at the attendant. "I'll have a glass of your best champagne," he said, loudly enough for those nearby to hear. He wanted to make sure everyone knew he belonged here, that he deserved this luxury. When it was Keanu's turn, he simply said, "Just water, please." Victor scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Water?" He raised an eyebrow mockingly. "You're in first class. You can have anything. Shouldn't you be enjoying it?" Keanu remained unbothered. He took the bottle of water, opened it, and took a sip, his expression calm. "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor smirked, shaking his head. "That's what people say when they can't have more," he remarked smugly, then took a sip of his champagne as if proving a point. Other first-class passengers had started to take notice. They could feel the silent tension rising between the two men. But while Victor was trying to assert his superiority, Keanu remained unfazed. Placing his water bottle down, Keanu turned to Victor, his eyes steady yet profound. "Maybe, but there are things money can't buy." Victor scoffed. "Oh, you're about to tell me that happiness can't be bought, right?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "No, I'm just saying that some of the most valuable things don't need to be flaunted." The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. A few passengers nodded at Keanu's words. Some turned to whisper to one another, while the flight attendants quietly observed. Victor, realizing the attention shifting toward them, felt a surge of irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who, in his eyes, wasn't on the same level. He took another sip of his champagne, leaned back in his seat, and tried to regain control. "Interesting," he said slowly. "I've met all kinds of people in my life, but you're one of the few who refuses to enjoy what's right in front of you. It seems like you're not used to luxury." Keanu kept his faint smile, but this time there was a sharper edge to his gaze. "Enjoying something doesn't mean flaunting it. I've learned that real value isn't in what we have. It's in how we live and how we treat others." Victor didn't respond immediately. He could feel the conversation slipping out of his control, and that unsettled him. But instead of stopping, he decided to push this confrontation to another level. What happened next wouldn't just change this flight, it would change Victor himself. Victor crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly, his smile growing colder. He wasn't used to being countered, especially not with such calm yet cutting precision. "You talk about values and the way people should treat each other, that sounds nice," he said mockingly. "But the truth is, the world runs on power. People judge you by what you own, not by empty philosophical speeches." Keanu didn't reply right away. He observed Victor quietly, as if seeing past the arrogance and into something deeper. After a moment, he spoke slowly. "So, you believe a person's worth is only determined by what they have?" Victor shrugged. "Not entirely, but let's be honest, who gets more respect? A man with pretty words, or a man who actually has everything?" He took another sip of his champagne, his eyes locked onto Keanu, waiting for even the slightest hint of doubt. But it never came. Keanu exhaled softly, setting his water bottle down, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I've met wealthy people drowning in loneliness, and I've met people with nothing, yet they commanded respect because of their kindness and the way they lived." Victor laughed, but this time the confidence in his laughter wasn't as pure as before. Easy to say when you've never had to fight for your place. Keanu tilted his head slightly, and for the first time, there was an unmistakable chill in his eyes. "You don't know anything about my life, Victor." The tension in the cabin thickened. Some passengers discreetly watched, while others pretended to focus on their meals, but everyone could feel the growing confrontation between these two men. Victor, sensing his grip on the conversation slipping, decided to go for the final blow. He leaned back in his seat, staring at Keanu with a challenging smirk. "All right. Let's put this to the test." He raised his hand, counting off his fingers. "Money? I have it. Power? I have it. Influence? Got that too. What do you have?" Keanu met his gaze directly, unwavering. "I have peace." The answer was so simple that Victor didn't know how to react at first, but before he could scoff at it, Keanu continued. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I don't need to impress, nor do I need to compete. And that, Victor, is something money can't buy." Victor went silent. Those words weren't just a response, they were a mirror reflecting back at him. A murmur spread through the first-class cabin as people realized that this wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a lesson, one that everyone could take something from. Victor sat still, but inside a storm raged. Keanu's words echoed in his mind like a sound he couldn't shake. I have peace, a concept that, despite everything he owned, Victor had never truly felt. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Peace, he scoffed. That sounds nice, but does it feed you? Does it make people respect you? In the end, everyone needs money, power, and status. Keanu simply watched him, his eyes full of understanding but without an ounce of pity. You're right, Victor. Money can buy comfort. Power can demand fake respect. But neither can buy true inner peace. Victor smirked, but this time his laughter felt hollow. You really think someone like me, a man who has worked hard, fought for everything with his own two hands, doesn't understand that? Keanu's gaze didn't waver. I don't think you don't understand it, Victor. I think you're running from it. The cabin felt heavier than ever. Some passengers exchanged glances, no one speaking, but everyone sensing the shift in Victor. The smug confidence he had at the beginning had started to fade, replaced by something else, something unsettled. You don't know anything about me, Victor muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. Keanu nodded. That's true. I don't know what you've been through, but I do know one thing. People who feel the need to prove themselves to others are often the ones most unsure of their own worth. Victor gripped the armrest tightly. Those words, simple yet piercing, cut deep. His entire life he had built his identity around wealth, power, and status, but now, with just a few words, Keanu had made him confront a truth he didn't want to admit. Everything he had still couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. The first-class cabin was wrapped in tense silence. No one was laughing, no one was whispering. All that remained was a man struggling with his own ego. Victor was silent, but inside him a storm raged. Keanu's words were like sharp blades cutting through the identity he had built his entire life. He had always believed that power lay in control, in making others respect and fear him, but at this moment he controlled nothing. He glanced around. Some passengers were still watching them. An elderly couple looked at him with puzzled expressions. A female executive furrowed her brows as if evaluating him, and a flight attendant hesitated, waiting to see what would happen next. To Victor, this was humiliation. He had always been the one in control, always the one in a position of power, but now standing before him was a man dressed simply, without arrogance, and yet he was the one making Victor feel so unsure of himself. Unacceptable. Victor laughed, but there was no confidence in it anymore. Then tell me, he leaned slightly toward Keanu, his voice sharp, if money, fame, and power don't define a person's worth, then what does? Keanu studied him for a long moment before answering. The things we leave behind in this life, not possessions, but the way we treat others. Victor scoffed. That sounds nice, but let's be honest, Keanu, you can afford to live by that philosophy because you're Keanu Reeves. If you were a nobody, do you really think anyone would care about you? Keanu smiled, but it wasn't condescending, it was understanding. Are you asking about me, Victor, or are you asking about yourself? The question froze Victor in place. The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. He felt as though Keanu had seen right through him. He had spent his whole life proving himself, climbing every rung of the social ladder, making sure he never felt small. But now, standing before a man who had nothing to prove, Victor had never felt smaller. His grip tightened on the armrest. Not out of anger this time, but out of fear. Victor sat motionless, Keanu's words echoing in his head like a relentless drum. Are you asking about me, Victor, or are you asking about yourself? It wasn't an attack, it was a mirror, reflecting the man he had become. He had spent his life chasing the highest levels of wealth, power, and influence. But why? Because he wanted respect? or because he feared that without the expensive suits, the recognition, and the fear he commanded, he would be nothing? He could still feel the eyes of the passengers on him, but this time they weren't watching because of his authority. They were watching to see if he had the courage to face the truth Keanu had just laid bare. Victor tried to regain control. He rested his elbows on the armrest, took a deep breath, and spoke, his voice softer now, still defensive but no longer arrogant. "So, what do you suggest I do? Throw everything away and live a simple life like you?" Keanu shook his head slightly. "No, Victor, it's not about giving it all up. It's about understanding that what you own doesn't define who you are. Respect doesn't come from power or wealth. It comes from how you treat the people around you." Victor remained silent. All his life he had believed that strength came from tangible things: money, status, influence. But now, facing a man who had none of those things, yet still commanded the respect of an entire room, Victor began to realize that maybe he had been wrong. No one in the first-class cabin spoke, but everyone felt it. This was no longer an argument. This was a man changing. Victor lowered his head, for the first time in his life not caring if he looked like he was losing. He spoke softly, more to himself than to Keanu. "Maybe I've been chasing the wrong things all along." The cabin remained silent, yet the shift in the air was undeniable. Victor sat there, staring at his hands, as if seeing himself for the first time. Keanu didn't say anything more. He knew that some lessons didn't need further explanation. Sometimes all it took was planting a seed. The rest would grow on its own. Victor was no longer the arrogant man who needed to prove himself superior to everyone around him. Now he was simply a man confronting the insecurities he had spent a lifetime hiding behind expensive suits and condescension. After a long moment, Victor sighed. He looked at Keanu, not with challenge, but with something genuine. "I was wrong about you." Keanu smiled, a calm, knowing smile. "I never thought you were right or wrong, Victor. I just think sometimes we forget what really matters." Victor nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. He no longer felt the need to prove anything. Maybe, for the first time, he understood that a person's true worth wasn't in what they owned, but in how they chose to face life. The rest of the flight passed in silence, but this time it wasn't tense. It was peaceful. When the plane landed, passengers stood to gather their belongings, but Victor remained seated, as if wanting to hold on to this moment just a little longer. Keanu stood, slung his old backpack over his shoulder, and looked at Victor. "I hope you find what you're really looking for." Victor met his gaze for the first time without arrogance, only sincere respect. "Thank you, Keanu. I'll start by thinking about that." Keanu nodded, then walked off, blending into the crowd of travelers at the airport, as if he hadn't just been the center of the entire first-class cabin minutes ago. Victor remained seated, a man who had once believed that power came from status and validation, now realizing that true strength came from humility and self-awareness. He let out a small, almost amused smile. Then he stood up and walked away. This wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. The story of Keanu Reeves and Victor Harding serves as a profound reminder that true worth is not measured by wealth or status, but by character and inner peace. In today's society, where success is often equated with material possessions, it is easy to fall into the trap of constantly proving oneself. However, Keanu's quiet confidence and humility demonstrate that self-worth does not come from external validation, but from how we treat others and how we view ourselves. One key takeaway from this story is the importance of remaining grounded despite external circumstances. Victor's arrogance stemmed from his belief that power and wealth dictated respect, but his encounter with Keanu forced him to reevaluate his values. This teaches us that true respect is earned through kindness, wisdom, and integrity, rather than through force or intimidation. To apply this lesson in our daily lives, we should strive to focus on personal growth rather than societal validation. Practicing humility, treating others with respect regardless of their status, and finding peace within ourselves are essential to leading a meaningful life. In the end, as Keanu exemplifies, true strength lies in having nothing to prove and living authentically, free from the need for external validation.